online on Facebook and YouTube. Really glad that you could be with us this afternoon. I'm Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom live and online. We've been learning the third section of the Hebrew Bible, Ketuvim, and we are in the middle of what is called the wisdom literature. So just to recap really quickly, in ancient Jewish times, if you had a question, either a question about religion or a question about life, there were three different people you could go to. You could go to the priest, you could go to the prophet, or you could go to the elder. The priest maintained the official traditions. The priest had access to Torah, which is the handed down tradition of the community. The prophet had access to God himself and could speak in the name of God. What did the elder have? What did the elder offer? Well, it turns out that the elder, as an elder, had a store of wisdom, and wisdom was practical. Wisdom was derived from experience. Wisdom was built up over time and shared with the young and with everybody else in the community. And so there developed a literature, a third sort of strand of tradition. We have a tradition of Torah, we have a tradition of prophets, and now we get to the third section of the Hebrew Bible. We have a tradition called the wisdom tradition. Now, wisdom tradition was passed on in two ways. It was passed on from father to son, from mother to daughter, in a kind of informal way in family. And then it was passed on in formal ways, either in schools. There were wisdom schools where wealthy young men would be sent and would be instructed in the ways of the world. And sometimes instead of a school, there would just simply be a mentor. And we hear that voice when we open the book of Proverbs. There were one of the addresses in the book of Proverbs is, "My son, let me tell you the way of the world." The book of Proverbs, of course, has two kinds of wisdom literature. It has these long form poems and these very short form aphorisms. And that's how wisdom was shared. Now, the book of Proverbs is what we might want to call conventional wisdom. The book of Proverbs we might want to call orthodox with a small o wisdom. It was the conviction of the book of Proverbs that righteousness would always bring reward, that righteousness would be rewarded, would be recompensed, would be reimbursed, and that if you lived a righteous life and you avoided the temptation of evil, then God would reward you with long life, with protection, with prosperity. That's the basic conventional wisdom of the book of Proverbs. It's hammered home over and over and over again in the book of Proverbs. We have two other books in the Bible which reflect the wisdom tradition, but they ironically come from a very different voice, a different place. They question that central conviction of the wisdom tradition, the book of Job and the book of Kohelet, of Ecclesiastes. Both of them derive from the same wisdom tradition, but both of them stand outside that conventional wisdom, outside that conventional orthodoxy with a small o, outside that conventional doctrine. And they question, and very openly question, is it true? Is it true that righteousness is rewarded? That piety brings prosperity? That your fate in the world is a direct reflection about the quality of your soul? Is that really, really true? Is that really the way that God organizes the universe? And we'll see this. The most cynical book in the Bible is the book of Job, is what we started reading last week. Kohelet isn't nearly as cynical. It's more shrewd. I mean, there's a line in Kohelet. We'll see this when we get to Kohelet, which will be a little bit later. There's a line in Kohelet in Ecclesiastes where he literally says to his student, you know something? Don't be too righteous. Don't be too righteous. Don't be a chazer. Don't be a shmuck. Don't be evil, but don't go overboard. Because, first of all, Kohelet argues for balance in all things, including good and evil. And second of all, he says, the world is pretty rough on pious people. The world is pretty tough on righteous people. So don't be too righteous. Remember Fagin in Oliver, right? You've got to pick a pocket or two. That's the kind of world it is, you know? And if you go into the world as a pure, honest soul and you walk the world with piety and righteousness, you're going to get smushed. You're going to get ripped off. You're going to get taken. So you've got to have a little bit of thief in you in order to survive in this world. Now, that is so different from what you have in, for example, the Torah, when it talks about Kedoshim Tihiyu, you will be holy because I, God, am holy. That is so different from what you find in Proverbs, where you're told over and over again, the way of the righteous is the way to a good life, and the way of the wicked is doomed. And suddenly comes Kohelet, and he said, not really. Not really. No, don't be evil, he says. Don't go overboard. Don't take advantage of people, but don't be too trusting either. It's a very interesting word. Here in the book of Job, where we started last week, we have a broadside attack on the basic premise that a good life, a righteous life, always yields rewards. That's just not the way God runs the universe, says this book. So we're going to find many voices in this book of Job. First of all, we saw last week that the book of Job is divided into two fundamental genres of literature. We have the prose literature of the first two chapters and then the last chapter. And we have the poetry, well, everything in between. And within the prose and the poetry, we have multiple voices. So let's take one more look at the prose before we jump into the poetry. But first, I want to make sure that everyone here has a chance to ask questions and give counter sermons. So anyone have a question to start with before we go on? Any questions? Yes, Douglas, please unmute yourself, please. Yeah, you have to unmute. I can't hear you. I'm really bad at reading lips.
When you talked about don't be too good.
That's Kohelet, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about that.
Yeah.
Where does the Israeli notion of not being a friar fit in?
Yeah, I think that's not unrelated. You know, except that the Israelis make it a defensive. A friar is a Hebrew word meaning a sucker, a dolt, someone who gets duped, someone who gets taken. Okay, so in Israel there is a very strong ethic of don't be a friar, which means don't let them take advantage of you. Don't let them get the better of you. Don't be a dope. You know, don't be stupid. Okay, so don't be a friar. Okay, that's a very strong ethic in Israel. I think part of it it's part of it's Middle Eastern, part of it's European. It's don't be the weak, passive Jew who lets the world trample on you anymore. That's a Zionist ethic, right? Part of it is just the toughness of a society that's always at war. And what happens there, the problem with that is that it prevents you from being gentle. It prevents you from being trusting. It prevents you from being to build relationships, because you're always looking out to get cheated at the end of this relationship.
Why can't they stand in line?
Oh, that's a whole different thing. I told you this, my own story, right? I told you this in a sermon. I told you this story once that I used to go shopping at Machane Yehuda early Friday mornings, and I'd come back to the bus carrying 2 or 3 big giant baskets full of my weekly groceries, and go to Nina's apartment to pack her refrigerator before I go study for the day. And I'm standing at the number 4 bus stop with these giant pekalach, these giant packages of or baskets full of food. And there's this big crowd of people waiting. And we wait and wait. One bus comes and there's only a little bit of room on it. One bus comes, only a little bit. Finally, a bus comes. I got to the front. I'm about to step onto the bus, and some lady comes along and just whacks me in the face with her elbow, grabs the last space on the bus. The bus doors close, and I see her laughing at me. And I got so angry. And I start shouting, like, what the heck is wrong with you people? I can't do that. Why does it happen? And all of a sudden, I told you this story, right? All of a sudden, there's this guy behind me. and he puts his hand on my shoulder, and in a nicely European accented Hebrew, he says very quietly and gently, he said, Chaver. He said, Chaver, Ele shechiku bator lo ispiku la'alot arza. The ones who stood in line didn't make it to Israel. And I see that on his arm are numbers tattooed. So this is a man who knows what he's talking about. He said, Chakeiti, stay here with me. You'll wait with me. There'll be another bus coming. We'll get home before Shabbat, I promise you. Right? It's a society of people in a hurry because they're all refugees. And they're all deathly afraid that if they don't grab the last spot on the bus, it might be the last bus ever to come. That's why. And that's how the country is. And you're right, it's an uncivil country. It's an uncivil, in that sense, it's uncivil. But in the other sense, this is off the topic, but on the other sense, I got to tell you that it's a society where you don't do anything for anybody because you're in a service position. You do everything for people who are your friends, right? So if you ask a waiter to give you good service, you're going to get crappy service. But if you say to the waiter, what's your name? Where are you from? Tell me about you. Could you do me a favor and bring me a clean spoon? You can get anything you want. You can get seconds on food. It's it's a personalist society in that sense. So they don't wait in line because it's anonymous. But if it's personal, like a friend of mine told me a beautiful story. His father was coming to visit, and my friend was living on a kibbutz in the north of Israel, and he's on a bus, and he asks the bus driver, do you stop at the entrance of this kibbutz? And the driver says, no, I'm sorry. I have to go all the way to the next town, and then you can get off the bus, and you can either walk back, it's a mile back, or you can take a cab, or you can get another bus back. My friend's father says, oh, okay. And he walks to the back of the bus, and he sits down, and there's a lady who says, you have to get to the kibbutz, right? And he says, yeah, my son is a volunteer on the kibbutz. But the bus doesn't stop there. He says, yeah, it's kind of a disappointment because I don't know how I'm going to get back to the kibbutz. It's kind of far for me to walk. And the lady says, this is not right. This can't be. So she turns to the guy ahead of her and says, can you imagine this man came all the way from America to visit his son, and the damn driver won't stop at the entrance to the kibbutz. And he turns to the guy ahead of him and says, can you imagine this man flew 10,000 miles to see his son who's building a kibbutz here in Israel. And the damn bus driver is going to write, and they go all the way to the front of the bus until the lady in the first seat walks up, whacks the driver with her pocketbook and says, what's wrong with you? Our friend is back here. He came from America to see his son, and you won't stop at the entrance to the goddamn kibbutz. How could you? Shame on you, right? So the guy ends up driving into the kibbutz and takes my friend's father right to the entrance of the dining room. And everyone from the kibbutz is watching because like no bus ever comes to the kibbutz. And they're like, how did you do that? Well, again, it's a personalist society. We'll do anything for you because you're a friend, but nothing because of the role, the formal role that we play. You get the point? That's a little glimpse into Israeli character for you. Okay, let's get back to the text. So I want to get back to the text we did last time. I know we did it, but I want to do it again because it's just too good. So the scenario is the following scenario. We have a man named Job, who the Bible acknowledges lived an upright and blameless life. Fears God, shuns evil. He's wealthy, and he's wise, and he's a good man. And what happens is that man has deserved the reward that's coming to him. The wisdom tradition assured us that if you live a righteous life, you will be rewarded. So there comes along the Satan. Now, that I told you last time, Satan does not mean the Satan. He's not a devil. He's God's alter ego. He's the voice of doubt. He's the prosecuting angel. And he says to God, of course he's righteous. Look what you've given him. Take away the blessings you've given him, and he will cease to be righteous. So what does the Satan accuse Job of? God is so proud of Job. I have this righteous man in an unrighteous world, and I'm so proud of him. And the Satan says, yeah, but Job doesn't really love you. Job isn't really good. Job isn't really righteous. It's transactional. You've given him blessing, and therefore he gives you obedience. If you took away the blessing, if you separated his righteousness from the reward and took away the blessing, he would curse you like all the rest. And God should say what? God should say, yeah, but you can't do that, right? You can't do that to the man. He hasn't earned that pain. He doesn't deserve that suffering. God says, okay, let's find out. God makes a bet, a wager with Satan, and Job suffers terribly. Now, it's such an interesting thing. Like, God is manipulated by him. God is seduced into this bet, and a man suffers terribly, and he loses his children, and he loses his wealth, and he loses his position, and he still, for all that, doesn't curse God. God has given, God takes away. Naked was I when I came out of the womb. I'm naked now. Nothing that I own matters. Nothing that I own I'm not entitled to anything, says Job. I'm not entitled to anything. Nothing is permanent. I'm willing to accept this loss. I won't curse God. I won't give up on God. I won't give up that God is good and loving. It's a remarkable story of a man of true and deep faith. It turns out that God wins the bet. God wins the bet. He took away the reward, and the man is still good. And then the story repeats itself, but this time it's not his wealth, it's his health. If he suffers physically, says Satan, he'll curse you. And God says, okay, but don't kill him. And now this time the same thing happens. He suffers terribly. And the wife comes along, and the wife is a very strange character here, because she is in some ways the equivalent of the Satan. If the Satan is God's alter ego, the voice of doubt, the wife is Job's alter ego. And the wife says, curse God. Actually, what she says is, you still keep your integrity, blaspheme God and die. If you were to curse God, you will die. He'll punish you and you'll die. So she still believes in a sort of quality of divine justice, right? And he says, don't talk that way. Should we only accept the good from God and not the evil? And for all that, Job said nothing sinful. So when we close this chapter, what we end up with is a Job who is righteous. This should be the end of the book. This should be the end of the book. Given the opportunity to discover that a man is truly righteous, we discover that he's truly righteous. He is, in fact, what we knew at the beginning. He is blameless and upright. We have found that out. And he refuses to curse God, even under the worst of circumstances, which is quite remarkable. And he refuses to participate in a blaspheming scheme. So he maintains his faith in God. He maintains his obedience to God's ways. He maintains his righteousness, even in the face of the terrible suffering. He believes that God is good. Now, the irony is, we, as the reader, we know something that he doesn't know. We know that God isn't so good. Because if God were good, God would never have done such a thing to a man. God would never punish. I mean, why would God punish a man for no reason, just to find out? Why would God do this to the guy? In fact, go one more step. What is God really doing? He's using him. He's become a poker chip in a wager. He's using this man, and this man has done nothing to deserve this kind of treatment from God. I mean, it's a horrifying look. It's a horrifying idea about God, and we know that Job is suffering for no reason at all. And it's not even that it's part of a plan. It's not even that it's part of a lesson to the world. It's no reason at all. There's no reason at all, because God's insecure and couldn't trust that his righteousness is real righteousness and needed to find out. So he tortures the man almost to death. I mean, so it's a very cynical book. Because now what's happened is we have three different points of view, right? What does Job think about God? Job thinks that God is good and loving, right? What does God think about God? God thinks he's just running the universe and can do whatever he wants. And what do we know about God? That sometimes God gets hoodwinked by Satan and people suffer terribly for no reason whatsoever. There is no relationship between righteousness and reward. In fact, it's Job's very righteousness that attracted the attention of Satan, of Satan, which brought all this horror. If Job hadn't been such a good guy, then he wouldn't have gotten smushed. But the fact that he was a good guy actually brought the attention of the Satan, which brought all of this suffering. So, as the prose section of the book ends, we have a very cynical, curious picture of the universe. But now we move from that to the poetry. And in the poetry, a new character rises up. It's the character of Job, the protester. And that's what we're going to see next. Okay, first Stanley and then Douglas.
Well, wouldn't you say that we've invented an anthropomorphic God, and that's what people that are, whether they're gods or not, that's what they do. They're not perfect. They do all kinds of things. Sometimes they do very good things.
Well, but the whole idea of being God is that you're supposed to be like pretty good, right? But this is a God who's like downright evil. I mean, what do you call it when you torture a person like this? This is torture. This is horrible, right? I mean, we were angry that America participated in schemes of torture during the wars, the Iraq War. Why would we not be angry about this?
I would.
I mean, so it's a very cynical picture of the divine, of God. You got to say that, at least that. Yeah, Douglas.
I'm not sure I'd say cynical, because all you have to do is look outside into the world and you will see Job.
Right.
So why is that cynical? If that is more reflective of the reality of the world than correlation between good and reward.
Oh, because if you look outside, what you find is there is no correlation between good and the world and good and reward, right? Yeah. There are very righteous people who got very bad cases of COVID. And there's some very bad people that got easy cases or didn't get COVID, right? There are very bad people who do really well in the world. And there's some really righteous people who get smushed, right?
Yes.
But this book goes one step further. It was Job's very righteousness that brought his punishment. It wasn't just that it was random. So if you say that it's random, that's not cynical, that's just pessimistic. If you say it's random, it's pessimistic. But if you say it's his very righteousness that not only didn't bring reward, but actually brought punishment, boy, really? That's how God runs the universe? The better you are, the more you suffer? That's like, woof. That's really
100 years of Jewish history.
Well, not necessarily, because that you could chalk up to randomness, but this is worse than random, right? Andy, please, just unmute. That's it.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I totally understand this before I make my statement. Satan is like an angel, or is it's an actual being that actually has this conversation, or is this all being held internally? Because
good question. Satan in the story, Satan is an independent being,
okay,
who is part of the heavenly court, but he is a being who has a right to challenge God on certain major interesting policy issues. So think of him as the nasty person on MSNBC or Fox, or think of him as the prosecuting angel in the court. He's the one who raises difficult issues. That's who he is in the story.
So using that premise and looking at the discussion, and again, I had to keep going back in this after we talked. So I looked at a lot of different sources. Is it true? Is it possible that, or from what I've read, God gave those powers to Satan. Satan caused those pains to happen to Job So in a sense, God only, I want to say, intervenes when he announces. Like he comes in, just like what he did when the Jews leave Egypt. He intervened. He let everyone know. He already let a spokesperson know, I'm coming in, I'm going to take you out, I'm going to do these following things. He didn't do that here. Is this the true meaning of, things happen to people and God doesn't really say, okay, you today on Monday, you're going to go and do this. And on Tuesday, you're going to do this. And on Wednesday, you're going to, it's people have things happen. It's by, not by, I know it's saying that they personally did it, but things just happen to people.
Yeah.
And
so if what you're asking me is, I'm not sure, let me get this right. If you're asking me, do people have free choices in this matter? Is that what you're asking? Do we have choices over our behaviors?
I was strictly going on the concept of, if you're saying God's an evil person or how can he let God do this? It's not that. God just didn't have the influence on this. This is showing that God does separate from people. Things happen to people for whatever reason.
No, but see, here what happens is Satan comes to God and says, he's not really righteous. He's only righteous because you've bought him off. So God gives Satan the power to punish him. This is divine power. It's God's power, but he's lending it to Satan to test Job. Now, Job has a choice. He can either accept the punishment and remain righteous. This is what he does in this story, in this part of the story. Or he could say, if this is how God treats me, I'm going to curse God. And then the question is, if he were to curse God, would God kill him? We don't know that. Okay. He believes that, by the way. He believes that if he cursed God, he would die. His wife believes that. That's why she says, curse God and die. It's better than staying alive. Right. So Satan has no independent power. His power is on loan from God. But he has the one power he does has is he can question God. He can challenge God. God says, oh, I have such a good man in Job. And Satan says, nah, you bought him off. Take away all you gave him and let's see what happens then. And then the horror is that God says, okay, because God should say, no, I'm not going to hurt my friend Job. What are you talking about? Right? I told you the worst analogy of this, which is just a disgusting analogy, and I apologize, is this awful television program called Temptation Island, right? Put on an island with absolutely gorgeous men, would your wife stray? The person, if you have to ask that question about your wife, you're not a terribly loving husband. That's the problem, you see? I mean, when you introduce that kind of doubt into it, like what kind of relationship do you have with somebody that you have to test them to find out if they really love you? That's not love. That's SAT. That's not love, right? You don't test someone you really love. But here, God gets seduced, gets tricked, gets manipulated, gets suckered into a test. And who suffers? Job suffers. Because at the end of the story, God's still God and Satan's still Satan. And the only one who's left hurting is Job. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I was just using it as the concept of is I never thought God was actually bad or good. I was just saying, if you look at it, technically God didn't do this. He might have given the power to people. He might have done that.
Well, technically you're right, but it's divine power. I mean, God does this. That's the point. That God hurt him, and God could have stopped it. Right at the end of the story, there's a really bad ending to this part, where God says, "Okay, sorry, I'll give you back everything. I'll give you new kids. I'll give you new wealth. New wealth is not so bad. New kids, I'm not sure that's what I want.
Gotcha.
You got it? Yeah, Mr. Garber.
If we define God as being all-knowing, then why the test?
Yeah, that's a fine question. So in the Bible, he's not. In the Bible, God is not all-knowing, or at least God doesn't know how human beings will respond. God acts, he's an actor, and he's an omnipotent actor in history, but he can't manipulate people for two reasons. Number one, he's always being surprised, right? He was surprised that Adam ate the fruit from the tree. He's surprised that Cain killed Abel. He's surprised. He doesn't know how people are going to respond, right? He's surprised that Pharaoh hardens his heart the first bunch of times. So, then the question is, and the other problem is that if God already knows what's going to happen, then do we really have the free will? And the question is, if free will is compromised, then can God really call us to responsibility, right? If everything is determined in advance, then you're not really liable for the bad things you do, right? You're not, because it wasn't your fault. You were manipulated. You were forced to do what you did. It was against your will. So the Bible has to admit free will in order to create room for human responsibility. The God is always being surprised by people. That's one of the great. It's like raising children. I don't know if you ever have the joy of raising kids, but you have these moments when you go to bed at night going, "What the hell just happened?" Like, I thought I knew these kids. Like, I raised, like, what? What? That's how God is. God is a parent of a young adolescent. Okay. All right. So let's take a look now. So the prose story ends with God, with Job's testimony, testifying to his righteousness. And then 3 friends come to be with him, and they offer him comfort. And then the transitional chapter is chapter 3, in which Job says, we have a different Job. Now, this is not, so I want you to see that the Job of the end of chapter 2, the Job who says, should we accept only the good from God and not accept evil? For all that, Job said nothing sinful. By the way, he never does anything sinful. It's all a question of whether he's going to say something sinful, right? He maintains his obedience, his loyalty to God, and his righteousness to the end. Chapter 2. Chapter 3, a different Job arises. This is a Job who's angry, right? This is a Job who's pissed off. Now, there's 2 literary things I want to point out. Number one, there is a question in the scholarship about the book of Job about whether these are the same author and whether these stories are really connected. Is this the same Job that we read about in chapters 1 or 2? Or is this just a man who's suffering? But even so, whatever it is, here's the important part. He doesn't know what we know. He just knows his suffering. We know that his suffering is undeserved. He doesn't know that. He thinks something's terrible happening. And now he is going to do what he promised not to do. He's going to question God. First, he's going to say, I shouldn't have been born, right? And that's what the whole beginning of chapter 2 is about. He says, why did anybody give birth to me? He curses his life. And then as we get to he's going to begin to curse God. He's going to begin to curse God because he says, I can't believe that a good God has done this to me. And that presents a problem for his friends, because his friends are going to represent the classical answers to this problem. And now becomes the second section after the prose, the poetry section of the book of Job, is a set of dialogues between Job and his friends, where the friends are going to present the classic answers to why bad things happen to good people, and Job is going to knock them all down. Now, what's interesting about this dialogue is that the speeches don't fit each other. You could see that this is a constructed dialogue, not a real dialogue. In a real dialogue, I would listen to what you said, and then I would answer, and you would listen to what I said, and then you would answer, and that's how it's supposed to work in a Jewish family, right? But thank you, Douglas. But what happens in reality, what happens here is that the speeches of the friends and the speeches of Job are really independent literary entities. So let's begin. We don't have a lot of time left, but let's begin. We'll take a look at the speeches of the, is this Job? Where am I? Let's take a look at the speeches of the friends. Oh, no, that's the wrong one. Let's take that out. Here it is. Everybody see this? So the first of the friends is a man named Eliphaz. They all have funny names, Eliphaz and Bildad and Zophar. Okay, they're not regular Hebrew names. Eliphaz the Temanite spoke out. So here's Job screaming at the top of his lungs about how much he wants to die and how much God has been terrible to him. And Eliphaz jumps in and he does something you should never do to somebody who is grieving. He tries to explain it to him, and he tries to comfort him with words. Eliphaz says, if one ventures a word with you, would it be too much? But who can hold back his words? So something that Job has said has made Eliphaz sit up and listen and speak back. See, you have encouraged many. You have strengthened failing hands. Your words have kept the stumbling from falling. You have braced knees that gave way. But now that it overtakes you, it's too much. It reaches you and you are unnerved. Is it not your own piety and confidence, your integrity of hope? Think now, what innocent man ever perished? Where have the upright been destroyed? As I have seen, those who plow evil and sow mischief reap them. They perish from a blast from God, are gone at the breath of his nostrils. All right, so this is the first speech of the friends. He makes two claims here. Claim number one, Job, you're always the one who told us about God. You're always telling us that God is good. You're always telling us that we have to accept the good along with the bad, that the blessings outweigh the curses. Job, where is your faith now? I mean, he basically, it's an answer, but it's kind of also a shtuch, it's kind of also a slug, because he says like you're always the one that told us that we have to suck it up and accept it. Why are you complaining? Now that it hits you, I mean, you can dish it out, but you can't take it. Now that suffering hits you, what happened to your faith? Where is your faith? And then he quotes the basic premise. And here's the basic premise of the faith, right? Think now, what innocent man ever perished? Where have the upright been destroyed? I have seen those who plow evil sow mischief and sow mischief reap them. They perish by a blast from God, are gone at the breath of his nostrils. Job, you taught us that righteousness always brings reward and evil always brings punishment. So has it ever happened that an innocent man, you can't, and therefore, why are you suffering? Why are you suffering? Because you sinned. So why don't you admit that you sinned? Because we agree with you. We agreed with you that God always punishes the wicked and rewards the good. That's how the universe is set up. We agreed with what's written in the book of Proverbs. So Job, why don't you just accept that? Why don't you just accept that? And then he goes on, and he goes on for a long time, by the way. Here's a second. Now here's a second claim. Ready? A word came to me in stealth. My ear caught a whisper of it. A thought filled visions in the night when the deep sleep falls upon men. This is very fancy poetry. Can mortals be acquitted by God? Can man be cleared by his maker? If God cannot trust his own servants and cast reproach on his angels, how much less those that dwell in houses of clay? That's the body, right? Whose origin is dust, who are crushed like the moth, shattered between daybreak and evening, perishing forever unnoticed. Their cord is pulled up and they die, and not with their wisdom. So Job, you claim that you're innocent and you're suffering so terribly. Job, is anybody that innocent? Nobody's that innocent. Come on, Job, you must have sinned. I mean, maybe you don't remember it. Maybe you didn't enjoy it, but you must have sinned, right? How many of you have ever been on a diet and you stepped on the scale in the morning and it was a couple of pounds higher and you said, no, I didn't eat anything bad. I didn't eat anything bad. And then your spouse or your friend says, you had a little ice cream last. A little ice cream? What good? That's not, no, I didn't eat anything bad. The scale doesn't lie. You must have. So what Eliphaz says to him is, Job, you say you're innocent. Nobody's that innocent. Come on, man. Fess up. All right, you sinned and you're suffering and it's horrible, but don't tell me that the universe is unjust. You sinned, right? You ate the ice cream. Come on. And it was a half a gallon, It was, come on. You ate the whole babka, It's in my house, what you do is you divide things in half, you see. So if you divide it in half and divide it in half and divide it in half and then eat each piece individually, it doesn't add up to anything. Right? That's one rule. The other rule is that ice cream eaten while the freezer door is still open, right out of the carton with a tablespoon doesn't count. Food eaten off the plate of your child doesn't count. If your kid leaves the French fries and you finish them up, don't count, right? So Eliphaz is saying to him, look, number one, you're the one that always proclaimed faith in a just and righteous God. How can you forget now? Just now because you're suffering, you forget that? Number two, he says, you're the one that taught us this. Righteous people don't suffer, so therefore you must have sinned. And then his secondary claim is, no one's innocent. There's no such thing as being pure and innocent. Now, what doesn't Eliphaz know? Job is innocent. What doesn't Eliphaz know? This isn't God's judgment. This isn't a judgment on Job's sinfulness. This is, in fact, an unjust verdict. But Eliphaz doesn't know that. We know that. We know something he doesn't know. And that makes the whole thing kind of ring hollow, because these are, after all, the voices that you ever been to a funeral and the preacher, the rabbi, the minister, the priest, the friend says, well, we have to trust that it's all for the best. And he's in a better place now. And God called him. I mean, now maybe those words are comforting to the mourner sometimes. But I can also see that those words would be really difficult to hear especially if you're experiencing a sort of real tragic kind of situation, right? What do you mean trust? God damn it, give me back my loved one, I mean, that you see it's a conventional theology, and the book of Job is poking at it. It's poking at it. Now we're going to hear the same idea in the next friend. So the second friend to come to him is named Bildad. Again, these are weird names. They're not usual names. And Bildad is more angry than Eliphaz with Job screaming. He says, how long will you speak of such things? Your utterances are a mighty wind. And now he gives him back the same theology. Will God pervert the right? Will the Almighty pervert justice? If your sons sinned against him, he dispatched them for their transgression. But if you seek God and supplicate the Almighty, if you really are blameless and upright, he will protect you and grant well-being to your righteous home. All right, so what does Bildad give us? He gives us classical Deuteronomy is what it is. It's the theology expressed in Deuteronomy. Righteousness brings reward. Sin brings punishment. Why did your kids die, Job? Because they were sinful. And why are you suffering? Because you're sinful too. But if you were to repent and ask God for help, God would save you. God would save you. Now, by the way, one of the things that the book of Job is trying to show you is these are things you never, ever, ever, ever say to a person who's suffering. Because you can hear it. I didn't give you Job's answers, by the way. In between these chapters, or Job, we're going to do that next time. And one of the things Job says to his friends is like, what kind of friends are you? It's one thing if the person who suffers himself says that, right? When I had cancer, there were people who said, you're going to be a much better rabbi now. And I said, you know what? I'd rather be an inferior rabbi and not have to go through this. It's okay if I say that. Okay, I learned something from it. But if you tell me that, it's really obnoxious, right? It's really obnoxious. I mean, my mother used to, when I was a kid, I'd smack my head on a cabinet and mom would say, oh, God's punishing you. It's a terrible thing to say to a child, by the way, because it just rubs it in. It says you deserved it, which means what you've effectively done is doubled somebody's pain, right? It's bad enough the poor guy lost his children. And you come along and say, yeah, but they deserved it. You've just, mazel tov, you've just doubled the pain. You've just doubled the pain. And then wait, it gets worse, as they say on television. But wait, because Job can't figure out what sin it was that he or his family is being punished for. So that you end up with this idea of God as a sort of black box. You don't know what's going to come out, because apparently righteousness doesn't give you a reward, but you don't know what sin you did. If this is the theology of sin, you don't know what sin did I do, and how can you punish me for sin I don't know about? The whole logic of punish me if I sin is so that I'll change. But if I don't know the sin, I can't change. So it just becomes, every layer of this, you can feel the pain increasing. You can feel his pain increasing. Let's finish Bildad, and then we're going to call it a day because it's a frustrating speech. Ask the generations past. Study what their fathers searched out. For we are of yesterday and know nothing. So what do we know? We're new in the world. But ask the generations. Our days are like a shadow. Surely the generations, will speak and tell you, speaking out of their understanding. Can papyrus thrive without a marsh? Can rushes grow without water? So he's asking a rhetorical question here. Papyrus is grass. Can grasses live without water? Can plants live without water? While still tender, they're not yet plucked. They would wither before any other grass. Such is the fate of all who forget God. So he's reiterating the classic theology that the only way to live well is to live in faith and loyalty to God. And Job, your protests about God's injustice just don't fit. The hope of the impious man comes to naught, whose confidence is a thread of gossamer, whose trust is a spider's web. He leans on his house, it will not stand. He seizes hold of it, but it will not hold. Job, listen to your words. You sound like one of these impious people. You sound like one of these impious people. No wonder you're suffering. Your very words are indicting you. But those who trust God will stay fresh even in the sun. His shoots spring like the garden, his roots are. So Job, if you will turn back to God and obey God's ways, I'm sure you will get rewarded once again. Yeah, and Douglas is making a face, which is right, because what the book of Job is doing is trying to point out that the classical answers to the question, why do we suffer in the world, are all empty answers. And the friends are empty answers. Now, what I haven't shown you is Job's retorts and how this, because the dialogue isn't really a dialogue. He's not really answering them. He's answering what he thinks God is thinking. And that we're going to do next time. But to start with, the question I'm going to leave you with is this question. Somebody you know has a tragedy in their life. Somebody you know has something that brings them suffering and pain. What do you say that works, and what should you never say to them? And that really is what's cataloged here in the book of Job. Okay? Any last questions before we conclude? Okay, everybody. Listen, let's have a better afternoon. Tonight at 7 o'clock, a wonderful conversation with Aviva Zornberg, the great scholar of Bible, led by Rabbi Kushner and me. We'll be meeting again next week at 12:30, Shabbos morning Torah study at 9 o'clock, and followed by a wonderful bar mitzvah, Tomer Tzur. And after that, Rabbi Hillel has his wonderful drashot. So everybody take care. Stay well, stay safe. Go get the vaccine.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.